You're listening to the Stand Out Now podcast with your host, Dave Mendonca. Check out each episode as top experts share their proven marketing, publicity, and sales tips to help you cut through the advertising noise so you can reach your ideal clients, get noticed, and connect with powerful influencers. The Stand Out Now podcast is brought to you by podcastinterviewexperts.com, helping entrepreneurs attract clients through business podcast guest appearances.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for listening. Our guest is a business and workplace expert who has written for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Fast Company. She also has appeared on CNN, ABC News, and CNBC, to name a few. Alexandra Levit, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Dave. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Alexandra, first off, here's a question I begin with all my guests. When you were a kid, what marketing or sales strategies, knowingly or unknowingly, did you use to get what you wanted?
You know, Dave, I would have to say that from the beginning of my life, it's been expertise. It's about I learn as much as possible about my subject, and I become the expert in it. And then I use that knowledge to convince other people of what they should be doing simply because I know more about it than they do.
Right.
And when it comes to marketing and sales today, you know, that's pretty much what I still do. I don't really rely on any kind of smoke and mirrors. It's just about spending hours upon hours studying something and just coming across as an expert. And I've been doing that since I was a kid.
So what specific example as a kid, what were you an expert in? Do you remember?
Well, there were a couple of things as a kid. So I would get really interested in space, and I would put together whole presentations. I even wrote a kind of a fictional account of a family going into space and used it to get my parents to sign me up for space camp because I just knew so much about it that they were like, well, gosh, she's really invested a lot of time and energy, and we don't know as much about this as she does. So she's done the cost benefit analysis of that, and why it makes sense for her to go and why it'll be beneficial to her future career. So I guess, I don't know, that's an example that I can remember of where I put together an actual business case and just showed how much I knew about it. And they eventually let me go down there.
Wait a second. How old were you when you came up with that?
I was about 11.
11?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So why space? Why was that interesting?
I don't know. You know, it's funny that I'm a futurist now because I've always been interested in science fiction and the great unknown and going out into the universe. And at that time, too, we lived very close to the World Future Society, and there was a lot of hand-wringing around atmospheric destruction. I know that we talk about climate change now, but there was a lot of talk that the atmosphere would be destroyed by pollutants and the sun would cause too many damaging rays. And in particular, I was very interested in well, how would we escape if that happened? How would humanity continue? And so I remember that being a thread that was kind of going through everything I was looking at that time.
At 11 years old?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So space camp, that actually exists. And what happens at a space camp?
It does. Well, when I went down there, it was just more of a, it's somewhere in Florida. I forget where. But when I went down there, it was more about just getting to look at the different equipment, getting to try out the different equipment. You obviously didn't go into space or anything like that. I don't even think we went into a real rocket, or did we? I don't remember.
Right.
It was a really long time ago.
Wow.
But it was all about learning a lot about all of the components. And actually, when I did that camp, I remember, though, thinking I'm not going to be able to do this because even at that age, Dave, I was pretty convinced that I was not going to be strong in math. I hate saying that because it sounds like the typical girl, girls aren't good at math. And I really don't mean to be a stereotype in that way. But in fact, as I grew, math really was not my strong suit. And I wish that it was because it might have led me to become an astronaut or an astrophysicist or something like that. But I never went into that line of work because I just did not have the mathematical skill. And I feel terrible being a female saying that, but that was the truth.
All right. So the dream of being an astronaut fades away. So when you're growing up, you're a teenager, what are your career dreams? What are you thinking about?
So I mentioned that I wrote kind of a novel-esque thing when I was 11 about escaping atmospheric destruction by going out into a spaceship. And I did go on and become a writer. All through my teenage and college years, I wrote novels. I have written about 4 or 5 novels.
Wow.
And I always thought I would be a writer. That was what I thought I was going to do. And in college, I majored in psychology. because that had always been of interest as well. And I didn't major in writing because I sort of always felt I could do that on the side. And I went out into the business world when I graduated and focused on marketing and PR, but I always had writing in the back of my mind. And surprisingly, even though I'd written all these novels and actually had one novel very, very close to publication,
wow.
I had an agent and everything. But what ended up happening was I just got really excited about writing this book about 20-somethings and how they could survive the business world. And I was just really, really passionate about this subject. And so that ended up being the first book that I got published when I was 26. And that book, I was very fortunate that it took off. And next thing I know, I have a whole career as an expert, author and speaker on the subject of workplace. And then the coolest thing that happened in my career was that I was able to combine my early interest in futurist stuff, which I mentioned to you a couple minutes ago, with my interest in workplace. And now I'm a workplace futurist. So it all kind of came together, and it's been just a lot of fun overall. But sometimes it seems like my career was kind of, all over the place. But if I look back on the past 20 years, it does seem to make a sort of sense.
Like, wasn't there a gap in your career where you were in PR, actually, right? You were at Edelman.
Yeah, that was the time when I graduated from college, and that was what I went into immediately following. And I have to say, the time at Edelman, I also worked for 4 years at a company that is now known, it actually just got bought. It was known as Computer Associates, then it was known as CA, and then now it just got bought. It was a Fortune 500 enterprise software firm. And between all those experiences, I really learned, I think, the ins and outs of the business world and what it means to be successful in business, and was able to have the expertise to write the book that I did, because I honestly don't know how people write on the subject of workplace and careers and business without having been in the trenches. So I learned a tremendous lot from those experiences. PR is the best training ground for any career that you could possibly want to have, and I wouldn't do it any other way.
So it's very interesting, Alexandra, like you're talking about how you craft your thought leadership, workplace, business expert, futurist, and all that. For the thought leader that's listening to this episode who wants to launch their brand and whatnot, how do they get themselves known? Like, you talked about being an expert and attracting people that way, but how do you start? How do you get just attention?
The one thing I would say, Dave, is that it takes a lot of time. This is what people underestimate. I've seen so many people come in and out of this space over the last 15 years. A lot of the platform that I have is due to just to longevity. It's due to the fact that I started pumping out content about careers and workplace in 2004, and I'm still doing it.
Wow.
So the search engines recognize that. You come up over and over again when you're in a media appearance or a podcast appearance. Somebody else hears that. They want to book you. So that's really how it happens. So I would have to say that you just get started doing a little bit at a time with your expertise, developing it, getting it out there, doing a podcast appearance here, an article there, and just talking to people about what you're interested in doing and collaborating with people who have platforms and seeing how you can contribute content, because that's the only way to do it. And I wish there was an easier answer, but the answer is longevity. You just have to keep going, and it's going to be slow. Some people get really lucky and they have an early idea hit really big. But I actually think that's not great to have happen either, because when your first idea hits really big, then you're constantly having to live up to that for the rest of your career. Whereas if you do kind of a slow and steady progression, well, then you're always getting hits and gaining momentum, and that feels good.
So at what point, Alexandra, did you realize, you know what, pumping out consistent content was the way to go? Like, early on, when did you think, okay, yeah, this is the strategy?
Well, I wasn't sure. So the book They Don't Teach Corporate in College, the first edition of that came out in 2004, and I had no platform at all at that time. So I just created a bunch of articles, and I placed them in different areas and on different outlets. And I waited to see if there would be an uptake. And over the next few years, I started gaining a lot of momentum with those articles, doing additional appearances, getting journalists to see those articles and then call me for interviews. I mean, podcasting didn't exist back then, but all the other internet outlets did. Blogging was a big thing when I first got started. That was kind of like podcasting is like the new iteration of what blogging used to be. And I think I realized I'd really hit it when, first of all, They Don't Teach Corporate in College was my only book to become a bestseller. I guess unless you count my new one, Humanity Works, is a bestseller in the UK. So if you count that, then I've got another one. But They Don't Teach Corporate in College was an international bestseller, and it just kind of caught on. It had a catchy title. Universities and companies were using it all around the world as a textbook, so that helped. And so once that book became known and I got a really good deal for my second book, I think that's when I realized I had something here. And then, of course, the pressure, Dave, is that you have to keep it going.
Yep.
And all the while, I was trying to make a living. I'm very fond of telling people that it took me 4 years between the time that first book was published to the time I went full scale and spent all my time on my business. 4 years of transition. And, that's not quick. So, and I'm not a risk taker. That was how I wanted to do it, to make sure I'd be able to earn a living. But all this time, I've had to focus on other things. It hasn't just been about building the platform. So I don't know if that answers your question. Hopefully it does.
Yeah, it does. So you're talking about how you had that gradual climb to actually making a living. So within that gap in between, were you working regular jobs? How were you supporting yourself?
So I worked at Edelman for the majority of that time, the 2004 to 2008. So between the time They Don't Teach Corporate in College was published until the time I went out full on my own. There was 4 years, and I mostly worked for the first year that I was working at Computer Associates. Then I moved to Chicago, and it really wasn't an option back then to keep working for CA while I was living in a different part of the country. And now we would probably, if that were today, I probably would have just kept that job. But I was moving, and so I went back and I worked at Edelman again. And I worked at Edelman part-time for the next 3 years. And then my deadline, I don't know if you'll find this interesting or not, but my deadline for making enough money at my own business to leave Edelman was having a baby. I knew I wanted to have a baby. It was time to get started with the family. I was 30. So I wanted to have the baby around 2008. So that became the deadline. And sure enough, my son was born in March of 2008. And that was when I stopped working at Edelman. And ever since, I've been doing my business full time.
Oh, wow. Okay. So there's something to be said about having a deadline. Love it.
Right. Good thing the timing worked out, I guess. I mean, obviously I can't answer what it would have been like if I hadn't gotten pregnant. Maybe,
For sure.
Maybe I would have given myself more time. But I don't know.
For sure. Now, Alexandra, there are many people out there who, they work the job, the 9 to 5, and they have dreams of working also that side hustle, right? Like that thought leadership on the side, which you were doing, right?
Absolutely.
What tips can you give people who are just hating their job, but they're just, just step by step working at their side hustle?
Yeah. And that's the thing. It is a step-by-step process. It's doing small things a little bit at a time. And I think it's really useful, Dave, to do a full-on assessment, to really know yourself and say, is my side hustle really something I want to do full-time? Is it something that's marketable? Is it something that there's a consumer need for? Because there's no shame in having something stay a side hustle. You can enjoy doing it, and it doesn't have to be your full-time job. I remember hearing all the time when I was getting started in this, are you sure you want to do this full-time? Because maybe you won't love it as much if you do, or if you have to make money off of it. And I think that's really valuable advice. And again, I didn't make that up. Lots of people told me that as well. And so I think that it's small steps at a time to ascertain not only can you gain momentum, but is it something you actually want to do more of? There's no shame in having a job that pays the bills, that maybe you don't absolutely love, that it's not your passion, but it's one area of your life. And then you have other areas of your life. I think companies are mostly, from what I've studied and what I see these days, companies are becoming more interested in what we call the holistic employee, meaning they recognize that people have a job that they're there to do, but that they also have different areas of their lives. They have friends, family, hobbies, things that they care about, volunteer causes, side hustles, and they're supportive of that. Whereas in the past, it was more like, we're just going to all pretend that the job is your life, and that's good, So, I would say it's a little step at a time. It's placing an article here. It's doing a speech maybe here or there at your professional organization to see if that's something. Just a little bit at a time to experiment with it and see if it's something that's better off staying small, or perhaps it's something that has bigger potential. But it only works if you try. And the worst thing that people can do is make an assumption. Very, very dangerous to say, well, I'm going to up and quit my job and I'm going to make a living, selling widgets on Etsy. Well, that may not work out too well. Good for you if you're independently wealthy or if you have a spouse supporting you, but otherwise that's probably not going to fly. So don't do anything drastic. Take the small steps. I've actually got a really, really good book. I have 2 books that are just on this topic. One is called How'd You Score That Gig? And the other one is called New Job, New You. And those are about, slow-paced career changes. So didn't really intend to talk about those today, but there you have it.
No, it's some great information there. I don't know. I think there are people out there, they don't do the reflective work, to really determine, okay, is this a fit? Because some people may be so desperate that their job stinks They just want to get out of there so bad. They're throwing ideas against the wall to see what sticks. So it's good to ask those questions.
Yeah, and that's fine to do. I think it's great to throw things against the wall. That's how innovation happens. But don't quit your job before you do that. And what I encourage people to do who hate their job is don't necessarily think the grass is greener. It's really important to take full stock of the opportunities that are available to you within a given organization. Especially now, companies are much more open to people moving around and developing a deeper bench of expertise. So let's say you're in finance. Maybe you want to do a stint in marketing. Maybe you want to go learn about sales. These are great cross-functional skills to have. And a lot of times you can learn a new skill and find something you're passionate about without even leaving your job necessarily. Same thing with things like volunteer work. I mean, I've never been able to be as involved with my volunteer causes that I love as when I was working at a big organization, because they made it easy to go and work at a soup kitchen, to go and, help out kids after school. Whereas now it's too much work for me to find opportunities to do that. And so look at your company for all the opportunities that it can provide. Because I think sometimes people they have a lot of tunnel vision around their immediate situation. Like, oh, I'm in this department working for this boss doing this task. Forgetting that it's kind of the sky's the limit. The bigger your organization is, the more opportunities you have. And thinking that another company is going to be better, that's kind of a slippery slope because a lot of companies are exactly the same. And young people make this mistake a lot because they haven't worked at a lot of companies. So they think, oh, I just ended up at a bad company. Well, probably not.
Exactly. And as well, to add to that, you could also look for the opportunities, the educational opportunities that you would be paid to do. Like
That's right. Great point.
If you could find courses that would help your company grow and also help you maybe with your side hustle, that's a win-win, and you get paid to do it.
Dave, you're absolutely, I'm so glad you brought that up. I should have brought that up myself, frankly. The tuition reimbursement, the taking of training that they might offer. And these are things that, and just to give a little bit of the futurist spin on this, we estimate that by about 2030, half of the workforce will consist of contractors, meaning that you won't work full-time for any one organization. And when that happens, companies are going to stop training people, because why should they? If you're pocketing all of the fruits of your labors and you're not giving them anything, why should they give you anything back? And so while we still have internal training, please take advantage of it, because that's not going to be around forever, for sure.
Yeah, good point. Swinging back to the thought leader, trying to get her name out there. So your PR background, I assume, helped you in regards to pitching to media. So in regards to that, what are some tips in terms of pitching? Like, you're newbie, you got the style leadership. Like, what are some tips to craft the pitch?
To be quite transparent about this, Dave, I don't know as much about this as I used to, because I went out into this space a long time ago and have kind of stayed in the space. So I haven't really even tried to get into it as a newbie. So I think that the PR landscape is significantly different than how it was in 2003 when I started this. But I mean, I would just do the smart things of making contacts. I still, to this day, and this was true when I started, and I think it's still true, that it's very hard to break in just kind of cold. I think you have to make connections with people who are in, for example, the professional association that might be affiliated with what you're doing. So I've gotten to know a lot of folks through, the association, the Society for Human Resource Management, what used to be known as ASTD, the American Society for Training and Development, which is now just ATD, all the HR related, the Human Capital Institute. And by getting to know the folks there and the publications that are associated with those, that's a great way in to an area of expertise that you might be trying to develop. And then once you're quoted there, you can start to get a little bit more mainstream, because journalists who are searching for those topics might come up with an article that you wrote in SHRM, or a place you were quoted in SHRM, for example. So I hope that helps. I mean, I don't know for sure that there is any easy way in. I think I'll still maintain that pumping out content is going to be the best way, and pumping out content not just on your own blog that nobody might read, but on established outlets. I was advising someone recently who wanted to become an expert in mental health and was writing her first book on it. And I was saying, why don't you write for The Mighty? The Mighty is an online outlet that publishes tons of articles, that has a huge following in the mental health community. And it's relatively low-hanging fruit in terms of getting stuff on there. So I recommended that she start there. And from there, she identified 6 other outlets that she was interested in publishing on, and then got invited to speak on 3 podcasts. And all of a sudden, this woman who had nothing to do with mental health was perceived as a mental health expert. That's how it works. But it's definitely a little bit at a time. And I think getting involved with the association or the community that's already focused on your areas is a smart approach.
Mm-hmm. You were talking about blogs, and are they still relevant? Like, I know for me how I consume content today. I'll look at my LinkedIn. I'll look at any LinkedIn content for sure on my feed, and podcasts. That's pretty much the content I consume. Blogs, in my mind, I don't look at blogs anymore. So are they still relevant?
I think most people are in your camp, Dave. It's funny because I remember talking with my boss at Edelman because we were on the forefront of digital media back in the early aughts. And we were talking about blogs. And he was convinced in like 2004 that blogs would not take off. And I was like, I don't know. I think they might have legs. And we were debating. I remember back in 2004, like, how long would blogs exist for? And I think we're finally seeing the end of blogs. Mm-hmm. I think really blogs have just morphed. I think they still exist, but it's just not called a blog. It's like you said, it's like a post on your LinkedIn. Yeah. Or my favorite example of how it's morphed is LinkedIn Pulse. You know, everybody has like their own LinkedIn channel, and that's basically a blog if you think about it. But it's connected to a social network. You know, Instagram has this, you know, Facebook have their stories. You know, it's the same thing. It's an ongoing, I guess, display or consolidation of content, but it's not really called a blog. I mean, I still keep a blog on my website, but it's more just as an additional showcase for what you were just saying for content that's on the social networks. So I hope that answers it. It's a long-winded answer. I think you're right. I think they're kind of irrelevant, at least in their traditional format.
Right. I know, that market's pretty oversaturated. There's over like 500 million, I think, blogs. So, I don't know. It might work for some people, but I just don't consume content like that anymore. But, I think having that content baked in to like a social media website like LinkedIn, I think it's the brand of LinkedIn and the fact that it's attached to all these. Like, for me, it's about opportunity. Like, for LinkedIn, to me, I see it as a sea of opportunity. And if I have content on there and I've carefully crafted my connections to cater towards or are in my niche, I think that's powerful. Whereas if it was just a blog on its own outside of that network, I wouldn't read it.
Right. Yeah. And I don't think anybody would. And that's why it's very, very dangerous to, if you go back like 10 years or so, there were people getting book deals based on popular blogs. And now if you start a blog, no one is going to read it. So don't do that.
It's interesting with the publishing industry. What I'm noticing is, yes, the people that were big bloggers got book deals, then it was YouTubers, and now I'm starting to see podcasters getting book deals.
Yep. It's always what's the latest big thing. And I think it's sort of the same thing I'm seeing, the oversaturation with podcasts now. Yep. Where just everyone's starting a podcast. And it's kind of the same. My advice to podcasters is sort of the same as it was for bloggers back in the day, which is just be aware of having something interesting to say. Yeah. Like, that's really important. But I hate people on Facebook who are just like, look at my picture of going to the grocery store and picking out frozen broccoli. That's a real example, by the way. Somebody on my Facebook feed a couple of weeks ago had that. And I'm like, what are you thinking? Your life is not that interesting. And so it's the same thing with blogging, and what was my advice with blogging and now with podcasting. It's like, do you have something interesting to say, or can you get interesting people to comment? I think that's really important. And do you even want to do it? That's the big thing. People were like, I'm going to start a blog. Like, really? You want to write 300-500 word articles every single week for like the near future? Seriously, you do want to do that? Okay, well, if you do, then go for it. But a lot of people don't want to do that. And podcasting is hard. You know, you've got a podcast. Yeah. Like, this is not easy. Mm-hmm. So, and you can't just do one. You have a commitment to it. And so, I don't know. It's one of those things, like, I would dip your toe in by being a guest on a few and deciding, like, how much do you really like having these conversations, and talking to podcasters about what it means to set up a podcast and market a podcast and get guests on a podcast. Because, I mean, I don't know if you would call it a full-time job, but I don't know. I'd get close. I think if you're going to do it well, it's close to a full-time job.
The way I look at it, Alexandra, it can't be an ego trip. Like, the way you got to see it, like the way that I think a successful podcast operates, especially if it's like an interview podcast, you have to be of service to the audience, especially in our space or the business space. People aren't going to listen to somebody just talk about their achievements all 30 minutes. So you got to figure out who your audience is, and you got to figure out what guests can provide that audience the most value and usable content. So it can't be an ego trip is what I'm saying. So if you got a valuable message that you want to pump out there, and if it's a weekly show, like, do you have a topic that or a theme to the show that has that kind of legs where you can do a show every week? More power to you, but it has to be about helping others, I think.
That's right. We're all in a service business. I mean, it's always about helping others. I mean, that's what's kept me. I think people are surprised sometimes to learn that I'm an introvert, but I am. And really what's kept me on the speaking stage is that idea of service and wanting to help as many people as I can. And I recognize when I go into a speaking engagement and I give advice about the future of work or how to manage your career or how to lead a team, it's helping more people than I could just talking to one person at a time. So I think having that mentality generally is good because that gives you a motivation to really move forward when things are not easy.
Oh, for sure. Now, earlier in the interview, you were talking about like holistic businesses and workers and whatnot, and you're talking about the future of work. It's just really curious. Are we all headed to something really terrible? The future of work? Like you're talking about how most of it's going to be contractors. Like, what are we looking at here?
Well, Dave, that's a big topic. But overall, I would say no, I'm hugely optimistic about it. And I know that's a position that's not common. We see a lot of really panicked people and negative thinking around this. But the way I look at it is there's tons of opportunity available. And the rise of the contract workforce means people are going to have more freedom than ever to pursue the types of projects that are interesting to them. Yes, it means people have to market themselves, but I think that as opposed to people being in dead-end jobs like you're describing, where they don't see any way out and it's hard for them to move around, this is going to be a boom for them. I am very excited about the rise of human and machine hybrid teams where algorithms and machines will take over parts of jobs that we may find less desirable and free us up to do more strategic thinking and leverage our unique human skills like interpersonal conflict resolution and empathy and judgment and intuition and creativity. And I'm excited about that. I mean, true, we don't really know what's going to happen after, I would say, probably 15 years from now with technology. It's going to evolve so quickly that it's hard for us to determine really what our society is going to be like. But if we're looking just from now until through the next 15 years, I think it's going to be a really fun, exciting time for humans to be working. And there'll be more opportunity than ever to customize your career to be exactly what you want when 10 to 15 years ago, you would just be stuck in something for your entire life. Right. And you would have chosen a line of study in college and you would go out and do it. And that's what you did for the rest of your life, whether you liked it or not. And now we have all sorts of choices. But, with choice comes responsibility. So it does mean we have to take more ownership over our careers. And for some people, that's not as much fun. But overall, I'm very, very excited about the future.
That's awesome. Now, the listeners of this interview right now, some of them are entrepreneurs. They have staff. So they're the ones that have to contend with the gig economy, dealing with millennials, Generation Z. So how does an entrepreneur today who has staff, how do they treat those staff in order to get the most out of them?
Well, I think you have to really look at everybody as an individual, more so than ever before. We are looking at a workforce of one now. It's not about, you have this group of people and they're cogs in a wheel. And so you really have to look at what does that individual need? And from a personal perspective, from a professional perspective, you have to really look at creating a meaningful employee experience for that person from the recruitment phase through onboarding, through training and development, through performance evaluation, then eventually transition. Because your goal is going to be, especially if you have gig workers, that you want them to kind of come in and out of your organization as needed. And that means you have to maintain a relationship with them. It's not just about working with them once and then they're gone. And, I think this is critically important. I hear all the time from entrepreneurs and companies who have kind of shift workers or people who have to be there on site. And they're just resigned to, okay, there can be no flexibility for these people. They have to be there when they're there. And they're resigned to these people are short-term employees and they're going to leave after a little bit. And that is what it is. And that doesn't have to be the case. You can build a long-term relationship with someone who might start with you as a cashier at McDonald's. Well, if McDonald's was smart, they would be funneling a lot of those people into managerial training programs because that makes sense. Why not take someone who knows the business already and is doing a good job, train them to do additional skills? And so that's where I see the future for people like that, who might be thinking, well, I don't really care that much about my employees because I shouldn't, because they're just going to leave quickly. And I don't think that's necessarily true.
What companies out there do you think are ahead of the game? Like they see those opportunities, especially what you're talking about, like the internal employees, that you see that they have skills, they know the processes of things and developing them. Like what companies do you think are really ahead of the game in that respect?
I mean, I would give industries. I would say a lot of the consulting firms are ahead of the game on this. I would say financial services to some extent. And the reason I'm saying financial services is because I actually see them plucking people out of traditional roles and putting them on innovation teams and really kind of trying to shape them into the next generation of leader. Consumer goods, pharmaceuticals to a certain extent. I mean, it's funny because sometimes you'll see companies that are like way ahead and then another company in the exact same space will just be like glacially behind. So I hesitate to, I don't want to like call out companies either way, good or bad. But particularly because I'm thinking kind of in the back of my mind of confidentiality. I'm like, I'm working with a couple who are doing really cool stuff, and I'm not sure I'm allowed to talk about it. So,
yeah, no worries.
But yeah, I mean, I would say financial services, consumer goods, consulting. And when I say consulting, I mean management consulting for the most part.
Got it.
End of the game.
For sure. So, Alexandra, it sounds like things are working pretty well on your end. And, you were talking about earlier how you had that 2008 deadline, baby deadline, to get things going. So what's the next big deadline for you? What's the next big career shift, or like, where do you see your thought leadership going? Is there a particular mentor or somebody that's achieved something in your space that you want to achieve? Like, what's the next goal?
Well, Dave, I would have to say that I've just done it. I've just done the pivot. So I moved from being kind of a generalized workforce and business expert, if you will, into doing a specialty in the future of work. And I started that around 5 years ago simply because I was always getting asked, well, now that you've told us how things are today, and particularly at the time I was talking a lot about generations, they're like, all right, well, what's going to be the next big thing? And why do you think that? And then I tend to realize, I don't know why, but I'm kind of accurate about some of this stuff. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's just reading a lot but when I make a forecast and I look at patterns, and that's what I think being a futurist really means, just like looking at patterns of things that are already happening and trying to decide, okay, well, what do I think is going to percolate up through the marketplace to really cause some big disruption? And so when that started happening, I was like, well, why don't I actually try to develop an expertise around this? And then I had it for a few years and then finally had enough material to write the book, which just came out, which is called Humanity Works, Merging Technologies and People for the Workforce of the Future. And that really was my big pivot. So now the big question is, and I think a lot of your listeners can relate to this, is how do I monetize that? It's great to have a book. And fortunately for me, this book's doing reasonably well, but it's quite another to create consulting programs around it, to create passive streams of income around it. Somebody who has done a remarkable job at this is Dory Clark. And you might know her. She's a friend of mine. She lives in New York, but she's everywhere. She is on podcasts. She speaks all over the world. She has really super successful online courses. And her niche is personal branding or personal reinvention. And she has just done a fantastic job, way, way, way better than I have. And, she just tries a lot of things, just like we were talking about a few minutes ago. She throws things against the wall, sees what sticks, works with experts, talks to people, makes great connections. And, I want to be her when I grow up. So.
Wait a second, Alexandra, you're pretty awesome too. Dory's amazing, but you're pretty awesome too. So don't be so modest.
Thank you, Dave. That's nice of you to say.
No worries. So how can people find out more about you, your books, your speaking engagements? Where?
Sure. Well, I would love for people to visit my website, which is alexandralevit.com. I would love for people to follow me on any of the social networks. I love Twitter. On Twitter, I'm at @alevit, ALEVIT, also on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. So get in touch. I mean, the fun thing about this book is that clearly it's going to need to be updated in a few years. So I'm interested to hear what people think. If there's something that I missed that they wish I would have covered more, or there's something they already could see needing to be updated, if there are resources that people think I should be aware of, or even if there are opinions, like, hey, I actually don't think you're right about this. It's so fun to have those discussions. I love when I publish excerpts on LinkedIn. And those are the best because I get like 100 people commenting like, no, I actually, and like there's a whole vibrant discussion around it. And I would just love to hear from people. So feel free to email me or get in touch anytime.
Amazing. Alexandra, thank you for being on the show. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Dave. This was fun.
Awesome. And thank you to all of you out there checking out this episode. Enjoy your week.
Thank you for listening to the Stand Out Now podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes and rate and review it as well. You can find out more about our program at thestandoutnowpodcast.com. Thanks again and enjoy your week.